Everyone, thank you so much for coming to today's webinar, Mentoring in 2026, Adapting to Diverse and Changing Needs. So my name is Leah Vaca-Michelle, and I'm a biochemistry professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology and chair of ASBMB's Maximizing Access Committee. As we all know, effective mentoring in science is evolving rapidly. Approaches that worked even a few years ago don't meet the needs of today's trainees and emerging leaders. Our scientific workforce is more diverse than ever in experiences, backgrounds, identities, expectations, and career goals. And with that diversity comes an opportunity and a responsibility to rethink how we show up as mentors to engage and support the next generation of scientists. Today's session will explore the realities of mentoring our current trainees in our current climate. Most importantly, you'll gain practical strategies to build mentoring relationships that are flexible, thoughtful, and truly responsive to the needs of scientists in 2026 and beyond. Before we begin, just a quick reminder, you're welcome to submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for audience questions and answers. This session is also being recorded, and the recording will be available on the ASBMB website. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Marisela Martinez-Cola. Dr. Martinez-Cola is a proud Chicana, daughter of an immigrant, and first-generation scholar. She attended the University of Michigan, where she earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and African-American studies, and then went on to earn her law degree at Loyola University Chicago School of Law, and her doctorate in sociology from Emory University. Dr. Martinez-Cola is currently an associate professor of sociology at Morehouse College and the director of the Institute for Social Justice Research and Policy at the Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership. We are incredibly excited to have Dr. Martinez-Cola here to speak about her article, Collectors, Nightlights, and Allies, Oh My, which is focused on mentoring in the academy. This article truly transformed the way I think about mentoring, and I have a feeling it will do the same for you. Dr. Martinez-Cola, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts about mentoring in 2026.
Yes, thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here and was so honored that you asked me to be able to talk about this particular article. So let's get started, shall we? All right. So as always, whenever you're teaching students, I like to give an agenda, to know where we're going. I'm going to get a brief introduction of myself, the genesis and purpose of the article, an analogy that I would like you to keep in mind while I'm speaking. And then we're going to talk about the categories that I identify in the article. And with that, after that, we're going to be talking about the trajectories. What are the trajectories of BIPOC or diverse mentees? And then finally, I'll give some practical advice, and we will discuss particular scenarios if we have time at the end.
Sounds great. So, are you able to share your screen?
Oh, it's not showing?
Not yet, no.
Oh, sorry. Okay, 1 second.
No, that's okay.
I thought it was. Let me check. There we go.
Awesome. Now it's perfect. Thank
you. Sorry about that. I had it on backstage. So really quickly, I think in order to understand the context of this talk, it's really important to kind of get to know me a little bit. As I said, I am an associate professor of sociology at Morehouse College. I'm thrilled to be there. I love being at Morehouse. And the other thing to know about me is that, I grew up in Battle Creek, Michigan. My mother's from Reynosa, Mexico, and my father's from Donna, Texas. My mother has a 2nd grade education and my dad has an 8th grade education, but they're two of the smartest people I've ever known. As was said, I am the first in my family. I'm the eldest of 3 daughters and the first in my entire family, both sides, to go to college. And what was really interesting is I ended up going to the University of Michigan, and the way that I decided to go there was I was working at the National Urban League, and I was there as a 9th grader. And there was a senior that was there as well. And they asked her, Teresa, where are you going to college? And she said, the University of Michigan, and the adults in the room just went nuts, like, oh my goodness, that's amazing, congratulations. And they said, Maricela, where do you want to go? And I said, the University of Michigan, because anything that got that reaction is where I wanted to go. And I didn't even know that it was 77 miles east of me at the time. And so one of the things I'll be talking about is my own academic journey and the people that I've encountered along the way. And I hope that you can find the stories helpful and useful to you. So let's start with the genesis of the article. When I was a graduate student at Emory, I was often asked to attend events where diverse students were present. As one of the few Latina PhDs or PhD seeking students, they wanted me to be able to go and give advice to other students that were there. And so there was a program called the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, which is an outstanding program that helps underrepresented students get research experience before they apply to grad school. And one of the things that was so amazing about that is that there was only students of color in the room. And whenever you have moments like that, it allows you to kind of be a little real, to sort of really talk, to everyone. And so one of the students asked me a question, and they said, what should we look for in a mentor? And I think I was feeling rather candid in that rarefied space. And I ended up saying, well, you're going to run into a bunch of different types of people. And there's going to be someone that you'll probably end up meeting that sort of likes to collect students of color. And I began to kind of talk about what that was. Now I'll talk about it with you all in a moment. And as I was speaking, I just kept seeing heads nod up and down in sort of an understanding of that. And so I walked away from that meeting thinking, I think I may have something here. And, ended up sort of thinking through this article and being able to come up with two more categories in addition to allies when you're talking about mentoring. So one of the things that's important that I also told the students is that there are very few of me in the field. This is all from 2022 and the fall of 2020. When you look, there are very few Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, multiracial professors that are out there. If you even look at my particular area, let's see. Yeah, this spot here, I make up about 2% of the population. And so I explained to students that, the ability to get mentored by somebody that has the same background as you is going to diminish significantly because there aren't very many of us. So you'll end up being mentored by somebody, usually somebody white. And so we ended up talking about that. And then I did more research and I realized there was a gap in the literature. There were plenty of articles with advice about how to be a mentor to a BIPOC or diverse student. There was lots of articles about advice for how BIPOC students could be good mentees. And there were lots of articles about white mentors' experience of mentoring students of color or people of color. But what was missing was the experiences of the students themselves in these relationships. There was one article that I found, but they interviewed the mentor and the mentee at the same time. And so I figured that the student of color would not be maybe as candid as maybe they could be if they were interviewed alone. And it was a good article, but I don't think it got to the heart of what I was hoping to capture. So there's an important analogy that I'd like you to consider as this is going on. This is a wonderful quote by by Alexander de Heijer. And he says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And basically the way that I tell my students is you don't blame the flower. A lot of times what happens is you'll have somebody that comes into an environment and they don't necessarily thrive in there. And it's really easy to be able to say, what is it that they're doing wrong in that environment to not be able to thrive? instead of being able to look all around it. If a flower isn't thriving, you look at the soil, you look at how much water it's getting, you look at, who's managing the flower, you look at all the other things sort of around it to be able to say, is it in the most ideal environment to be able to actually grow? So just keep that in mind. One of the other things that I came to was people wanted me to give a definition of a mentor. And I love this quote from Carrie Ann Rockamore. She says, if you ask 10 different faculty members what mentoring is, how it works, what it looks like, and how to tell if it's effective, you will get 10 different responses ranging from a once-a-year coffee date to a quasi-parental lifelong relationship. And that is so true, and that has been so true of even my own experience. And so I ended up thinking through the categories, and I ended up coming up with allies, collectors, nightlights, and allies. And so I'm going to explain the three very briefly. Collectors like to collect BIPOC or diverse mentees. The mentees often feel like they're on display. The mentee is often asked to serve on diversity committees. And sometimes it feels like their representation, like whenever their mentor is really using them to be a representation of their commitment to inclusion and diversity. So it's, being able to say, look at how many students I'm helping, look at how dedicated I am to the cause, so to speak. And it can be very challenging to sort of feel as they're part of that collection. And they'll do things, for example, like take you to a dinner, a diversity dinner, but they won't necessarily introduce you to people around there. You don't ever get invited. So, one of the things that I noticed when I was in undergrad and grad school is that many of my white counterparts were invited to the professors' homes, and I never was. And I found that really, really interesting. Now, one of the things that I want to keep in mind, however, is that this is very and often unintentional. Collectors don't realize they're being collectors. And I had students ask me one time whether or not you should tell a collector they're a collector, and I told them no, never. Because one of the things that's challenging is collectors think that they're allies. And that, being able to have that cognitive dissonance if you end up telling them, in fact, you're a collector, that's why I wrote the article in hopes that particular white mentors that are out there would be able to do some work, some self-work to say, gosh, am I a collector? Is this what I do? The other category I thought of was called nightlights. And I came up with this name from a student, an undergraduate student that was very clever. And I was talking to them. I was talking to a group of students, and I was telling them that my husband and I, my late husband and I, were going to take my father to go buy a car. And my father is, a short Latino man, we're almost as tall as each other. And so the student said, don't forget your nightlight. And then everybody started cracking up in the room and started laughing. And I was not in on the joke. And I was like, I don't know, what do you mean? And they said, don't forget to take Greg, that's my late husband, Greg with you to the car dealership because you'll probably get treated differently. And, and what they were saying, I realized was very true. There were instances, there have been more, my husband was white. There were several instances when I asked him to do things for me because I just wasn't, in the mood to sort of do that, So, for example, I would say, hey, I need you to make a phone call for me because I was concerned that once they hear Maricela, and I'll forget sometimes, and I'll say, instead of Mari, I'll say Marcella, depending on, the environment. And I didn't feel like doing that anymore. And so sometimes I'll ask him to make the phone call because I felt like he was going to get further in the conversation than I would. And so that's kind of what a nightlight is. A nightlight understands the inherent challenges at HWIs or predominantly white spaces. They help BIPOC mentees navigate the unknown and unforeseeable curves and twists. They're kind of like a guide through the process. They provide light in dark, unfamiliar spaces. And usually this particular group uses their privilege and their social and cultural capital to help the student. And I'll share some students about that as well. I'll share some stories about that. And they help make the invisible visible to the diverse or BIPOC mentees that are there. They all those sort of unwritten rules that we just don't know about, they make them written, and they say what are sort of the instances to be able to that you need to be able to use that. I call them my translators. Um, and so then you have, of course, you have allies. They're the least likely that you will encounter. I shared with students. They make meaningful connections without asserting equality. One of the things that I've noticed in my research is that many allies have some other identity, some other diverse identity attached to them. They're either first generation or came from a working class background, or they're Jewish, or they have some other kind of experience, or they're, LGBTQ plus, and they're able to sort of make connections, but they don't say, I'm this, I'm first generation, so I understand what you feel like. So they don't necessarily put an equal sign between the experiences and understand those are still very different. And allies' actions speak louder than their words. Allies don't have to say they're allies. Allies just are allies. They're just being allies. The other thing about it is they can take criticism and feedback and recover quickly. This goes back to whether or not you tell a collector that they're a collector. What'll sometimes happen is if I end up sharing with a colleague that something that they said, bothered me, or I felt that, it was, racist or discriminatory or something like that, or it just didn't sit right with me or was inappropriate. What'll end up happening a lot of times is the person that I'm telling, and they're usually, usually white, will start crying. They'll start saying, no, 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 I swear I'm not racist. This is not it. I didn't mean that. I didn't do it, and they'll get really upset. And then what ends up happening is I end up comforting them, saying, no, I know you're not racist. That's not what I was saying. I just wanted to share with you my experience, but don't worry, it's okay. And so I end up comforting them, but I was the one that was hurt in the first place. And so that's one of the things that an ally is able to take that criticism and say, thank you so much for telling me, I'm going to work on that, without trying to make excuses or without over apologizing or without making it a super uber big deal. Allies also build trust with consistency and humility. They understand that they don't know fully the experience. They would never understand what it means, for example, to be a Latina in higher education. But they want to learn as much as they can and grow from being able to watch and see and be a part of my journey. The other wonderful thing about allies is they push their mentees beyond their best. Collectors sometimes think, oh, maybe they're not able to handle it, and they try to sort of, make things. They try to make things maybe easier for the mentee. But allies, on the other hand, know that the mentee can do it and pushes them beyond their best and says, I'm pushing you because I know you can do it. And that's one of the things that I find really, really wonderful about allies in particular. So those are kind of the three categories. We'll talk about, there's these, I know there's lines in between these, but those lines can be very fuzzy as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Whenever I started to give talks about this, and when my article got published, I received several emails from people. I received several emails from white mentors that said, oh my goodness, I never thought of it this way. Thank you so much. And then I received a lot of emails from people of color and from a variety of different areas and spaces. They weren't all in academia. Some of them were in the corporate world. Some of them were, in education, and they would tell me that the article helped them feel seen, that I was able to name an experience that they had, to give what their experience is a name, and to realize they were not the only ones that were going through that. And so that's one of the things that I think I feel most proud of with this article, because when you publish an article, at least for me, you hope that it touches somebody, that it is able to be useful to someone. And for my article to end up being useful to the students or to people in general, was something that I've truly, truly appreciated. Now, as I've been giving this talk about this article, I realized there were a few things that more people wanted to know. And so I added these next two items to this talk. So the first thing is kind of a basic trajectory that many BIPOC or diverse students will have or will have in their lifetime. So for example, in K through 12, school is very much their life. Most, if not all of their teachers are white. One of the things that I did one time when I was teaching is I said, how many of you have ever had a teacher of color? And it was really interesting. You see this, they're sort of thinking, and then there's this realization, and they're like, oh my goodness, I've never, and many of them would say, you know, Professor MC, you're the first one I've ever had. And they're in college and, at that point. And so most of the teachers and people that they encounter throughout their career have been white. This is also the first time that many children realize that they're different in some way. I remember for myself, it was really interesting that I was playing in the mud with my friends. One friend was white and the other one was black. And they were pointing to our skins and they said, she's white and she's black. What are you? And I said, I don't know. Let me go check. And so I went and I ran inside and they said, oh, I should say this. They said, you're mixed. And so I ran inside and I asked my mom, am I mixed? And she was like, no. And I was like, well, then what am I? And she said, well, you're brown. And so I ran outside to my friends and I proudly proclaimed, I'm brown, from that moment. And this is when kids also start to make differences, uh, around sort of different identities. And also many of the mentees that you may have may also be the first in their family to go to college. And that's a really big deal. And that can be really challenging sometimes because on one hand, some of your family members are like, go for it, do great, so on and so forth. But then when I got to college, another set of my family members were like talking to me like, now you think you're all bad. And so I got these mixed messages, oftentimes whether or not going to college was a good thing in my family or a bad thing in my family. And so going to undergrad, the differences also become painfully clear. There was a time that they were doing a diversity exercise in my residence hall, and it was called Cross the Room. And so they would line up all the students on one side of the room, and they would say things like, cross the room if you like pizza. And so it's like, ha, 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 everybody likes pizza. And so you see a lot of people crossing the room. And the ideas would get more specific, and then it got to the point where it said, if your parents make more than $100,000 a year, cross the room. And a whole bunch of students ended up crossing the room. And there was only a handful of students on the other side. And they said, well, if your parents make more than $75,000 a year, cross the room. And then another set of students left. And there were only two of us on the other side, myself and my friend Sintwali. And Sintwali looked at me like, don't worry, I got you, And they were like, if your parents make more than $50,000 a year, because their goal in their mind was to get everybody to cross the room. And Sintwali's mother was a teacher. And so she made more than that. So he ended up crossing the room and I was on the other side all by myself. And I looked across the room and I could just see a sea of mostly white faces looking at me with almost a sense of pity, which was really, really frustrating at the time. And I remember telling them, I said, my parents make $48,000 a year. What of it? And one student said, how can you afford to go here? They, asked me that question. And, I answered them, I told them I was, I'd gotten several scholarships, things like that. But one of the things that I realized later in life, as I look back at that idea was the reason why I knew how much my parents made so closely was because I was the one that filled out the FAFSA form. My parents didn't really know how to fill out those forms, so I had to be the one to do all those. And there's several students that have never filled out a FAFSA form, never been able to see what their parents make. Often in undergrad, there'll be a work study student. They'll end up working and studying at the same time, and they often send money home to their family members. Being first gen can go from being an honor, when you're before college, everybody's so proud of you, it's so wonderful, you're the first in your family to go, to becoming a label, that you're a first gen and it's looked at like you're less than in some way, shape, or form, or that it's a deficit model thinking that says there's something wrong with you for being first gen. And there's been some really wonderful changes that have happened across universities. They call them first gen scholars, different things like that, to be able to really highlight how wonderful that identity really is. And in undergraduate is when many students begin to assert their identity, and get connected with different affinity groups related to them. You go on to graduate school, you get a million hoops, and there's very little progress, it feels like. And the smaller numbers equal bigger diversity responsibilities. So you end up doing more. So then you end up going into the workforce and you become the diversity hire. And one of the things that I recently wrote about was about my experiences working at PWIs versus working at an HBCU. And one of the things that I shared was that at every university that I worked at, I was always the diversity hire. It didn't matter how much I published, it didn't matter how accomplished I was always going to be seen that way. But at Morehouse College, I'm a scholar and I'm treated as such. And I'm not just asked to do diversity things. I'm on the IRB. I'm on, the faculty council. I'm on a lot of different areas that aren't necessarily related to what I can do to educate groups of people. And most of the time I would at PWI say yes, because there were so few of us. Who else would step up and do it? Not to say I'm the only one that can do it, but, I felt compelled to say yes many of the times. The other thing too is that this is a point in time, and when I carried with me a very special interaction that I had when I was an undergraduate. I remember that I used to kind of walk around Michigan, so grateful that they accepted me, and I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe they accepted me, and I was there during the affirmative action time when there was lawsuits going on. And so there was that extra added sense of feeling like you're only there because you're an affirmative action student, right? And I had a mentor sit down and talk to me, and they said, Maricela, you act like Michigan did you a favor. And I was like, what do you mean? She goes, you walk around here and act like they did you a favor. Where else were you accepted? And I told her all the other schools I was accepted at. She goes, you could have gone to any one of those other schools, but you chose to come to the University of Michigan. Your presence here makes Michigan a better place. Man, after that, I owned that school, and it helped and carried me all throughout and still carries me to this day, to be able to say that there's something about my experiences that make a unique contribution to wherever it is that I'm at. And I really am so grateful for that mentor for being able to tell me that. Now, some other things that are necessary to know is there's things that we have been taught in our lives that are sort of our own unwritten rules. And some of them you've heard, some of them you may not have heard. So the big one is you have to work twice as hard to get half as much. I can't tell you how many of my fellow students or people of color have said this to me or have talked about how much this is just true for them. They'll accept mediocrity from their own, but they won't accept it from you. You have to be excellent always. One of the things that I remember thinking about was when I was in grad school, there was a professor who was teaching us a book called Black Wealth, White Wealth. And it's one that every sociologist should read. And he comes into the room, turns the book around, reads the back of it, and says, "What do you all think?" And this was a tenure track professor. And I remember sitting there thinking, I could never get away with that without somebody complaining that I was unprepared. But yet he was able to be able to do that. The other thing is you have to always look ready. Don't give them something to say about you. You have to look dress nicely, have your hair done just so, being able to, you don't want them to ever be able to say, oh, wow, well, Marisela, isn't really being very professional right now, isn't acting or dressing in a professional way. And so that's one of the things that we've been taught. Um, the other thing is fix your face. That is a really big one. Fix your face. This means that whenever you're in a meeting and somebody says something that is offensive, you cannot go like this. You cannot do that. You have to fix your face. One of the things that I remember in grad school is I was in a class, a history class, and the professor was talking to the whole group and said, "Come on, everybody, what is this ultimately about?" And the students it was silent. None of us really knew what he was talking about. And so he said, Marisela, you know what we're talking about. And I said, I'm sorry, Professor so-and-so, I don't know. He said, immigration, of course. And I remember sitting there and feeling like, immigration was not my area of expertise. I am not an immigrant. And I remember kind of sitting there wondering why he would have said that. But I couldn't do it. And my face had to be, a poker face. And the only way I knew that this was something, when stuff like that happens, you kind of wonder, did that just happen? I think that just happened. Yeah, that definitely happened. And I didn't really have confirmation that it happened until I looked at one of my white friends in the classroom and I looked over at him and he just went like this. And I was like, okay, it's not me. It's not just in my head. So you have to fix your face. Before you ask the question, find the answer first. Don't bother busy people. This happens a lot with many diverse populations, and particularly with first gens as well. There's this idea that you're bothering people, bothering a professor when you go to talk to them and ask. You need to be able to find the answer first, or be able to have a question in mind before you go and talk to them. And many of them don't realize that that's what we're there for, is to be able to go and talk, even if there's nothing necessarily that you want to talk about, to be able to sort of make that connection and get to know each other. The other thing too is to ask them about themselves because it's their favorite topic. So this happened when I was interviewing to go to grad school. And so one of the things that I did is I got a list of who I was going to be meeting during the interview process, and I went and read some of their articles before the meeting. And so in the meeting, we would end up talking, and I would say, I read your article about such and such, can you talk to me more about that? And then the person was like, oh, yes, and blah, 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 and just would talk and talk and talk and talk about themselves and their, research and so on and so forth. And then by the end, they would be like, I like that, Marisela. But they didn't learn a single thing about me in that process. And so that's one of the things I find, sort of funny. Never make them cry. Again, this was, I talked back about how I've at times when I've asked somebody or I told somebody that something was offensive, that they ended up crying. You learn very quickly to not do that. And so, so there were many times that something did happen and I just didn't say anything because I didn't want to have to deal with the aftermath of it. If they ask a question, be careful what you say, give a very measured response. This goes to wanting to make sure that people see you as intelligent and capable. As mentors, one of the things that you say, please don't say, just tell your family you want to ... Because it's not always easy to go back to your families and tell them, I don't want to do X, I want to do Y. Because particularly when you're a first generation, there's one of four things you're supposed to do. You're supposed to go to medical school, law school, business school, or engineering. And you do any of those, you're great. Now I stink at math and science. So that knocked 3 out right away, but I could argue well. So I ended up going to law school. The other big thing is that you don't just represent yourself, you represent your family. You are representative, and there's this whole idea of don't embarrass me while you're out there. And you end up sort of realizing this and carrying that on throughout your life. So one of the things that I would like to give as quick advice for collectors is understand that when you take us places, one of the first things we do is count. We go into a space and we look around a room, and I count how many people of color are in the room and how many women are in the room. And that's just something really quickly. And there's this really interesting thing that happens with people of color in the room. You sort of lock eyes and you kind of say, like, I see you too. And you end up, eventually talking to them at one point. But you can't talk about them, you can't talk with them too much, because then that's you're self-segregating, self-segregating, if you do that. Asking what can I do is not enough. You need to let us know what you can do. So you can say, I can make this phone call for you. I can connect you with so and so. There's this scholarship I know about that I can blah, blah, blah. Because many times we don't know what you can do. Only you know what you're capable of. If you ask us to do something, know that eventually we may need to ask for you, we may need to ask something of you. And one of the things that back when I first talked about the collectors with the students, the students would say, oh, that's so frustrating. Oh, I hate when they do that. And I would say, you know what? Don't, you know, um, don't necessarily sort of count out collectors, because collectors often know where the resources are. There are collectors that I've had in my life who've been able to, for example, show me where I can help a student get, a laptop after theirs was stolen, or, a collector showed me about an internship that, I could direct a student to. They have information and resources that are not necessarily known. The other thing too is that you get the performance, not the person. That can be really challenging as well, because you learn, and this is another thing that I talked about in my article where I compare my experiences. I didn't realize how much I was performing in white spaces, how much I was performing a palatable, manageable Marisela, and how much I really had to think about everything that I was doing until I got to Morehouse and I finally felt like I could breathe and I could be my full authentic self. There was one time, for example, that I was, whenever I get an article published, I turn on Celia Cruz and I dance in my office. And when I was at another institution, a white institution, somebody walked by the room when this happened at one point and said, "Ooh, you're so spicy." And I remember feeling like, you just messed up my groove. You know what I mean? And I stopped doing it there. But when I got to Morehouse and I did it, you want to know what happened? My students and my colleagues came in and danced with me. And that's such a huge difference. For nightlight tips, be ready for taco moments if you can. One of the stories that I tell in the article is about my elementary school teacher named Mr. Geibig. I brought tacos to school, and this was before tacos were really popular. And so the kids around the table were like, "Ew, what's that? That smells funny," things like that. And so of course you get embarrassed sort of immediately. And Mr. Geibig, who was the most popular student in the school, walks up and goes, "Oh, are those tacos?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can I have some?" And I said, "Yes." And he ended up taking a little bit of the taco, took a bite, and was like, "Oh, thank you so much," and winked at me and walked away. Now he could have said, and in that moment, then what do you think the other kids said? "Oh, can I have some?" Blah, blah, so on and so forth. Because if the most popular teacher's doing it, then it must be cool, right? So he turned my weird into something cool in a moment. Um, Also, ask the question that nobody thought to ask. When I was younger, I was put into speech therapy because I used to say jello instead of yellow and cheese instead of cheese. They thought that I had a speech impediment of some sort. And so they ended up putting me through the process of becoming, going to a speech therapist in the classroom. And the speech therapist said, say cheese. And I said, cheese. Say yellow. And I said, yellow. And she said, "What's a ship and what's a chip?" And I knew the difference, between the two, because, that can get confusing sometimes as well. And so she said, "Marisela, why do you say jello and cheese?" And I said, "Well, that's how my mom says it." So I came from a background where, my mother spoke mostly Spanish, and was learning English along the way. So she had a pretty heavy accent. And so she asked a question nobody thought to ask me while they were going through that process of putting me into speech therapy. Intervene when you can, when people are tokenized. One of the things that I had a colleague do one time is they were asking about questions about, a race, and they started to talk to me about it. And He stood up and he said, you know what, we're all smart people here. I recommend that we go and conduct research on this topic and then come up and revisit the discussion. Marisela is not the only expert here, and so isn't responsible to be the only expert here. And I remember really appreciating that. Take a moment to read their work or to drop a quick note to tell them that the work that they're doing is really wonderful and appreciative, just to be affirming. For allies and accomplices, share from your own life, ask them about theirs. Talk about how pedigree doesn't necessarily equal quality. So it doesn't necessarily matter where you went to school, it matters who the person you are now. Respect your mentees' time, their work. Don't just tell a mentee what to do, you need to model it and practice it. And understand that this takes time to be able to handle. Also, be honest with your own limitations and admit your mistakes. If you can say, you know what, I don't know anything about that, but let me see if I can get you connected with somebody who does. That is the kind of humility I was talking about earlier. And be honest with the students. Be honest with what it is that's going to happen. I tell people, I call it the real deal Holyfield. Anybody that's into boxing, tell them that, what's really going on. Tell them the rules that maybe they don't realize or understand, and being able to connect them to that. And then increase your own interactions and their interactions with BIPOC or diverse researchers. One of the things I remember a professor having is lots of pictures of Black scientists in her room. And I remember thinking that was so awesome to be able to see, Black scientists there, because as a person of color, I was like, oh, wow, they're out there. And even though I didn't want to necessarily go into science, it was really cool to be able to see them there. So I was going to go through some scenarios, but we won't necessarily cover that. So what to remember about some of us? Some of us can appear and be a little prickly. So if you can love us when we're prickly, then we know that you're the real deal. Some of us also have learned to be the shiny object in the room, but don't forget the ones that are quiet. Some of us have been forced to shine, and others of us have been told to keep our heads down and just do the work. We are extraordinarily creative. One of the things that when I did my dissertation, my advisor said, Marisela, you're doing 3 dissertations in one, really. And I said, really? Yeah, no, okay, yeah, that's what I want to do. And it really made me feel really special to be able to do that and be told that, I'm going that extra mile in that. We're extraordinarily resilient. Remember earlier I talked about, there's times where flowers can bloom out of concrete or dry desert, but that's not the kind of world you want to create for your mentor. But we've been taught and we know how to be able to bloom even in those environments. And finally, we're unicorns, but we don't know it. We don't realize that we're one of the few people that are there that represent that particular or those particular groups in the space. So why do all this then? Because we're so worth it. And one of the things that when you have diverse people in your life, it really adds to who you are as a person. And there's a gratitude that needs to sort of accompany that, as well. So final thoughts. These are not static categories with clear lines. One person's ally may be another's nightlight. Also, all allies are also nightlights, but not all nightlights are necessarily allies. And unfortunately, a collector is never an ally, but they often believe they're an ally. And that's one of the more challenging parts about that. So I went a little bit over my time, and so I want to be able to get to questions. So thank you all so much for allowing me to share that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez-Cola. So I'll get us started with some questions.
Okay.
So the first question, this is tough. Currently the research and biotechnology environment are really tumultuous. I'll add academia in there too. Challenges all over the place, and even entry-level positions in industry are more difficult than ever to secure. So do you have any practical advice for mentoring all students through this time? Even though you're not a scientist, just in general mentoring, it's a tough time to be a student, maybe ready to graduate. Do you have any practical advice for that?
Yeah, being able to, share with them, be honest with them about what the field is like. and being able to, help them to sort of cast a wider net, to be able to get sort of different ideas about how to do that, and then help them and look over their application product, help them look over their resume to see if, that's something that, they have the words that are necessary to be able to be a good candidate for a position. So yeah, that's just one of the few things that I would recommend.
I love that. And, honestly, from reading your article and some of the things that, that I implement or that some of my colleagues implement, I really like how you talk about being a nightlight. And there's so much stuff that our students, I think we're not necessarily aware that they don't know, right?
Right.
Because I think we live our lives, including myself, I live my life and I kind of learn things along the way. And then all of a sudden I get to this point in my career where I've been working for a long time and I'm like, oh yeah, students don't
Yeah,
realize this. They don't know
exactly.
that you should send a thank you note after you have an interview. They don't realize how you maybe need to act when they take you out to dinner, right? And so these are all the things that nightlights do is shine that light on kind of those hidden things or the things that maybe just not everyone does necessarily just naturally learn or pick up along the way. And so I think it's really important that we share those with our students. You know,
Absolutely, 100%. I agree with you 100%. I had one of my because I was asked out to dinner a lot, and one of my wonderful allies taught me a really cool trick, to put my hands like this, a B and a D. So because I would go to places and they have a round table and I wouldn't know which one was my bread and which one was my drink. And so I would just under the table be able to do the B and D and I knew which one it was. And I was so grateful that he showed that to me because I would often just sort of wait and see what everybody else did, before that. And I'm sure I looked really confused most of the time, but I'm super grateful he taught me that.
oh, that's great advice. That's
Yeah.
perfect. All those little tidbits are great.
Yeah.
For those of you, please do put your questions in the chat or the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. Here we have another question. How to deal with collectors the right way. So having a mentor in the lab who likes to make groups collect students and sideline the rest. Someone who wears a job, or this is the person who's asking the question. They're usually ignored when it comes to invitations to different events outside the lab or lunch or get-togethers. They've been called on occasions vocal and aggressive, while the rest of the girls are, appreciated and suggested to be vocal about their needs. Do you have any advice about that? Like having to you said, you don't necessarily want to make the collector feel bad or get upset, but at the
Mhm.
same time, sometimes it's important to, address those concerns. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. And I want to, make sure that I hope that I didn't kind of give across the impression that, you need to sort of always walk on eggshells. I mean, there are times when you just need to be direct with a collector, and one of the things that I like to do is I learned it a while ago. It's called a compliment sandwich. So you say something really good, I really love working in your lab, so on and so forth. I'm learning a lot, so on and so forth. Um, However, there's something I wanted to be able to address if we can, to be able to talk about. This is kind of what's going on. And if we can, work out, this is one of the things that I've noticed, and I would really like to be able to sort of talk about that and talk through it. Because again, I really enjoy being here and I've learned a lot. And like, for example, this is what I've learned. So it's sort of being able to put your, the issue that you have inside something that sort of makes them remember that there's still some good there. That they're not terrible, awful people, for doing this. Because I think that's one of the things that can be very frustrating for them is that when if they're told that, they're often sort of framed as a bad person. And so I think being able to sort of minimize that as much as possible. So trying to do sort of a compliment sandwich, is a problem sandwich, I guess is what you can call it, to be able to do that. Because yeah, absolutely. I was going to tell another story, but
No, that's fantastic. And one of the things that it reminds me of is that um, when we are mentoring, we make mistakes because we're still learning too. And I think, that's something that we have to remind all students that faculty aren't necessarily perfect. We're still on our education journey. And we might have collector moments. So whereas we might not necessarily label ourselves a collector, not that we'd want to ever want to label ourselves as a collector, but we might be able to kind of look back and reflect and say, oh, wow, that was probably a collector moment, right? So in that case, where we're having these moments and maybe get called out on them,
Mhm.
what can you give advice as to the mentors and how to respond to those? Because I think it's kind of instinct to be defensive
Right.
and get upset because it's not our intention to be, mean or whatever. So can you give advice to people, to those kinds of mentors who really are well-intentioned, but then kind of
Absolutely.
realize, oh, yep, that was a collector moment.
Yes, definitely. And as I said, as I shared, many of the collectors are doing things that they don't, it is often unintentional. They have no idea and realize that they're doing it, you know. And so one of the things that I would say is, you tell the student, you assure the student, and you tell them, thank you so much for sharing that with me. This is going to help me to grow as your mentor, and I want to make sure that I can be the best for you, that be the kind of mentor that you need. So thank you so much for telling me that. I'm going to take this back. I'm going to really think about it, to be able to say, now, is there something you wish I would have done differently? And we can, sort of be able to talk about that. And it's not, and an apology is like, I'm really sorry that I did that, you know, um, rather than I'm really sorry that you felt that way. That's a different kind of apology, and so really being able to, that's the humility that it is I'm talking about. And a lot of, academics, we can, we get our egos kind of get going a little bit. And, it's really hard to be, can get in the way. And so it's just, apologize sincerely, ask them what, could have been or what they would have wanted them to do instead, or not do, and really go back and reflect and think about, what it is that you did and be able to see how many other times have I done that before, because this is probably not the first time you've done it, so that's the thing. I think just to try to be as thoughtful as you can for yourself. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So a question that I had was that I mentioned at the beginning during the introduction that a lot of times mentors and mentees have unmatched or mismatched expectations.
Hmm.
So kind of the mentor is expecting one thing from the mentee, and then the mentee is expecting something else from the mentor. So can you talk a little bit about your strategy as far as making sure that we can align better or addressing those mismatches, those mismatched expectations?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. One of the things that I often do with my mentees beforehand is I sit down and I say, it's almost, you talk about what is it that you need from me, in this relationship. And we can talk about what it is also that I would appreciate from you. And be able to talk about that. And if there's a thing that, and you get to a point where you say, and there have been times when I've had people that I just could not, I don't think I would be a solid mentor for them. And I would say, you know what, your needs are really unique and different. And that's not something I think I can necessarily do, but let me see if I can connect you. I'm thinking of somebody that I know you would work really well with. So let me see if I can connect you with that person, to be able to get your needs met as well. And so being able to sort of talk those expectations out at the very beginning of the relationship, I think is very critical.
I think that's really good advice because I think that sometimes, and doing that as soon as we can
Yes.
is really important because I think sometimes we get too far and we're just like, oh, well, it's too
Yeah.
late now. But
Mhm.
yeah, and I think, we talk about these mentor-mentee relationships, and some of them are more, this is the relationship, this is your boss, right? This is so they're you don't have to necessarily consider them your mentor, but they're your boss, right? And
Yes. Yeah.
those you might not be able to help. But
Right.
finding a mentor who's a really good match for you, where you can match those expectations, and that might not necessarily be your boss, that might be someone else that's not your that isn't in your research group or whatever it is. There might be somebody else in the department or someone else in the college, right? And I think that's really good advice. And being a mentor and saying, I'm not, maybe I'm not the right match for you, but trying to help them and find the right match for them. I think
Absolutely.
would be
Absolutely.
the best way to go. We have another question. So this person has a main PI and then two co-PIs. And sometimes their feedback opposes each other, contradicts each other.
Mm.
How would you deal with that kind of situation? And you want to obviously make sure you take into account all the feedback without making anyone feel left out or make them feel unheard. Uh, uh,
Gosh,
what's your advice to them?
that is a hard one. Wow, that is a hard one. You know, this reminds me of times when, I've gotten a review back and the two reviewers say something totally different. One says take this out and the other one says put it back in, or keep it in. And so one of the things that I do is I actually point that out and I say, there's a conflict here, between I'm getting mixed messages. And I really want to be able to help kind of, suss it out if we can, and let's do it together. And you want it this way and you want it that way. Is there a middle ground that we can have to be able to meet in that middle place to do that? Because I think sometimes, it's okay to get the two sides that are not necessarily on the same page together to talk. And you may not get on the same page, but you at least get in the same book, so to speak. So yeah,
Yeah. So talking to them about it and like maybe even scheduling a meeting where you can talk about it because
absolutely,
I think if because they might not know that the advice is contradicting.
absolutely,
So then if you and you just explain it to them and you say, I'm getting this and I'm getting this,
yeah.
can we
Yeah,
work on this all together? Because that would be, so that and usually hopefully people will be amenable to that.
absolutely. Yeah, to tell people that one of your goals is to be able to have some form of consensus, and unity among the group. And so in order to achieve that, what do we need to do to get there?
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Mhm.
Do you have anything in your institution that you can share that helps support mentors? Because one of the questions is, how can institutions better support their mentors, right? Mentoring is not an easy thing. It can
No,
be complicated, and we don't necessarily have training for it. We kind of just are thrown into these positions. Do you have any suggestions on how institutes can support their mentors?
absolutely. I think one of the things that institutions can do is to try to make it part of the structure. So, for example, one of the things that I really love at Morehouse is that you have, your teaching, scholarship, and service, right?
Mhm.
Um, and, many times your service is just sort of whatever it is that you do. Well, they recognize mentoring as a part of that service. And ask if that's the kind of things that you've been doing. It'll ask, have you mentored students? So on and so forth. So that's one of the things that I really love about that was so different from all the other institutions that I've been at, because and recognize the emotional labor that goes and accompanies that, as well. So I think make it count where it's necessary and important, and also being able to provide spaces and opportunities, so one of the things that a wonderful organization, one of the sections in my American Sociological Association had was they gave $15 coffee gift cards, to be able to say, here, go, this is for you to go and have, coffee with your mentee to be able to do that. So actually being able to sort of spend some funds or get them to be able to find opportunities to be able to get them together, to discuss, really make an investment in the process. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martinez Cola. Thank you to everyone who came to today's webinar. We're really grateful. We'll be following up with a survey. So if you could please fill that out. We want to be able to offer this programming throughout the year for you. So thank you so much for coming and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this.